Behind closed doors of modern congregations, a specific suffering is quietly taking place. Victims of severe domestic abuse are looking for a way out. When these victims approach church leadership for help, the counsel they receive often blocks their exit. They are instructed to return to their abusers and endure the physical danger. To enforce this directive, leaders point to a single, isolated quote from Christ: "What God has joined, let man not separate." Bible teacher Vijay Nadella points to this pastoral response to expose a critical issue. He argues this is a fatal hermeneutical failure, a breakdown in the science of interpreting Scripture. In 1 Timothy 1:8, the Apostle Paul writes that the biblical law is good, provided a person uses it lawfully. This standard forces a massive question. Does trapping a victim of torture within a marriage contract meet God's definition of lawful use of the text? The context for Paul's warning was first-century Ephesus. He fought false teachers who aggressively wielded Old Testament laws over the local church without understanding the mechanics of the code they enforced. This chart shows the mechanics of that error, taking an ancient legal command and applying it at a 1-to-1 ratio to a modern crisis, bypassing the historical context and the work of the cross, generates disastrous system errors that destroy lives. Which brings us to a diagnostic question. Do modern Christians know what the biblical law is, who it was designed for, and how God intended it to be deployed? Applying Scripture without first understanding its foundational legal architecture does not yield righteousness. It takes the very words of God and turns them into a heavy chain to bind the oppressed. To fix the application, we have to look at the Ephesian false teachers. Their specific agenda was to drag early Christians backward, forcing them to submit to old behavioral mandates and rituals. To counter this, Paul relies on the theological architecture of the Old Testament. The law operates through 3 distinct codes: moral, civil, and ceremonial. The civil code governed the nation of Israel, outlining specific societal punishments, like stoning. The ceremonial code dictated religious practices, including animal sacrifices and circumcision. At the crucifixion of Christ, both the civil and ceremonial codes were nullified. The ultimate sacrifice had been paid, rendering the old rituals and national punishments obsolete. Paul uses a legal analogy in Romans 7 to explain exactly how this expiration works, using the mechanics of marriage laws. Under the law, a woman is legally bound to her husband. She must adhere to the vows of that union, but only for as long as he is alive. Upon the husband's death, the legal binding is severed. The widow is free from the obligations of that specific contract. Paul maps this directly to the Christian experience. Believers died with Christ on the cross. That death severed the legal obligation to the old civil and ceremonial codes. The moral law, the commands like do not steal and do not commit adultery, remains active, but the way those moral laws are applied to humanity has shifted. Enforcing obsolete legal codes today, or misapplying the surviving moral code, ignores the severing event of the cross. This is spiritual malpractice. We can now apply this concept of lawful application back to our opening scenario. How should the church handle the moral law of marriage when dealing with a battered spouse? Jesus directly addresses the legalities of marriage and divorce in Matthew 19. When asked why Moses provided a legal avenue for divorce, Jesus explains that the certificate of divorce was granted strictly due to the hardness of your hearts. But Jesus follows this by stating that from the beginning it was not so, adding, "What God has joined, let man not separate." Nadella isolates a vital theological nuance in this exact phrase. For a union to actually be joined by God, it requires 2 repentant individuals who have been spiritually baptized and are operating with the mind of Christ. A spouse who is physically torturing their partner is functionally not operating as a Christian. The baseline requirements for a divine union have been violated. Trapping a victim in that home by quoting Matthew 19 enforces the strict letter of the text, while entirely violating the spirit of the text. Extracting the true intent of a biblical law requires rigorous exegesis, an analysis that accounts for context, culture, and the nature of God. This is why the book of Acts shows an Ethiopian finance minister reading the prophet Isaiah, but needing Philip to explain it. Scripture requires guided interpretation, not reckless proof texting. The unlawful use of the law occurs when leaders apply rigid textual mechanics to complex human suffering, completely ignoring God's redemptive intent. If the written law is this easily weaponized, why did God introduce it in the first place? Paul provides the answer in 1 Timothy 1:9. He states plainly that the law is not laid down for the righteous, but for the lawless and disobedient. To see how this works, look at the timeline of biblical jurisprudence from Galatians 3. There is a massive, empty gap between Adam and Moses. Paul details the exact timing. The Mosaic Law was a temporary addition that arrived exactly 430 years after God made his initial promise to Abraham. The text defines the purpose of this addition. The law was added strictly because of transgressions. This creates a theological paradox, which Paul addresses in Romans 5. In the centuries spanning from Adam to Moses, there was zero written legal code from God. Yet, despite the total absence of a written code, death and judgment still reigned over humanity. People were still held accountable for their sins. Here is the central mystery. If sin is defined by breaking a law, how could God justly condemn humanity before the Ten Commandments even existed? The paradox is resolved in Romans 1 through the concept of general revelation. Humanity traded the glory of God for idols resembling humans, birds, and animals. Early humanity possessed the law of conscience. By simply observing creation, they inherently knew God's requirements, but they actively suppressed that truth. The historical evidence for this is the life of Job, a man who lived and suffered before a single word of the Bible was written. In Job 31, he states that he made a covenant with his eyes, not to look lustfully at a young woman. He formulated a strict moral code internally, proving the moral law existed in the human conscience. So if the internal conscience was sufficient to reveal morality, why did God eventually need to chisel the code into stone? Nadella uses a highway analogy to explain this necessity. Imagine a driver going the wrong direction down a highway. When the car collides with oncoming traffic, the result is deadly. Driving into traffic is inherently wrong based on the laws of physics. The danger exists regardless of whether there is a sign posted on the road. Without a formal written statute and a defined penalty, the governing body has no legal basis to prosecute the driver or fine them for the violation. God introduced the formal Mosaic Code to strictly quantify human sin. It provided a legal framework for judgment and restrained societal lawlessness through the fear of punishment. Romans 3:20 synthesizes the final theological function of this entire framework. Through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Think of the law as a medical thermometer. If you have a deadly infection, the thermometer will accurately tell you that your fever has spiked to 104 degrees. It perfectly diagnoses the deadly condition, but swallowing the thermometer will never cure the disease. The law functions to expose humanity's total depravity and our absolute need for the cross. It was never intended to be a behavioral checklist for salvation. We are left with a choice. We can use Scripture as a humble diagnostic tool for our own desperate need for grace, or we can weaponize it as an unlawful chain to bind others.